Welcome to What the Heck's, your source for Warhammer Underworlds in under 30 hammertide pings. Tonight I'm your host Phil, and joining me is our local fish aficionado, Skyler. How are you doing?
Doing pretty great. This is the episode that I'm excited to be on, breaking it down.
Yeah, well, we're excited to have you to be able to be our local Idoneth expert. If you couldn't have guessed by that, this episode is going to be our deep dive on Cyreni's razors. But before we get to that, some quick context for recording. We are recording on October the 11th, 2023. Deathgorge is on pre-order? Maybe? It is no longer on the GW website, and according to some posts on, so they like put those links up on Facebook that say like upcoming pre-orders or whatever, and they link out to the website, and it shows the Warcry box and Deathgorge. But if you click on the link to go to the Deathgorge piece, it just gives a 404 error, and people are like, I'm getting an error. And they're like, it's delayed in North America and Canada. And it's like, you should have announced that. But, here we are.
We have a realm reset. We have a new box. We have so much hype. And it's like, people just want to get their hands on it.
Yeah, just excited. Right? So hopefully it's not going to be delayed too long. But it'll be what it is.
I suppose not a new realm, a realm refresh in the sense.
A new take on an old friend. Ogre, we cannot quit you. But as always, as part of beginning to do these early takes and deep dives, we are always thankful for getting these review copies from Games Workshop. So despite having the disappointment of a delay, we understand, and we are very grateful to have had a box now for a few weeks to be able to dig in. As I had mentioned, the topic is Cyreni's razors. We are going to try to do as thorough of a coverage as we can for having not actually played them all that much. We're going to try and talk through sort of what they do well, what they don't do well, what we think you should try to do with them as you're trying to figure out what your play styles will be, what the strategies you use would be, and then potentially some takes for like what are we doing with these in Nemesis, what are we doing for these in Championship, and if you are not planning to play them, but you're planning to play in a community that will almost certainly have them, what might you do? This is not going to be a card by card rundown, though. If you would like to read all the cards and all the detail and see our takes on them from the entire What the Heck's cast, we have that up over on our blog, and that can be found at the mortalrealms.com's What the Heck's page, or you can find it linked on our other episodes. But before we go through all that, we have some normal topics and some fairly large news. Community shout-outs. Skyler, do you have anything that you'd like to shout out?
Sure. Yeah, I'll kick it off here with breaking news at the time of recording. A new podcast has been spun up. It is named Underworlds Underground, and it is helmed by Saxtum, Fish Mode, and Sleekspool. Those are handles that I'm familiar with across the Discords. That is 2 mics and a Saxtum.
Well, maybe they should just change the name of the show. That just rolls off the tongue much better, right?
Two mics and a Saxtum? Absolutely. Yeah. I'm so excited. I haven't had a chance to listen yet, but Sleekspool, I have a drive into work tomorrow, so I'll be listening to you on my drive in.
There you go. Yeah, I mean, if someone had asked me earlier today, what would you think if there was going to be a new podcast? I would have been like, well, who's going to be making a new podcast? And it's great to see these guys collaborating, though. And I am happy to have more Underworlds content just generally. And I like what Fish Mode's been doing. So I like the idea of him contributing to a podcast. So good luck, guys, and I'm sure you're going to do great.
I am incredibly enthusiastic. I know without having listened to it yet that it's going to be worth your time. Definitely go check them out.
Yeah. And of course, as happens with most new releases in this game, you get a deluge of content from all the different content creators. So whatever your format of content that you prefer, whichever hosts you prefer to listen to, whether that be because of how they present the content, or perhaps you just like some people's voices better, go check them all out, because everybody's got different takes. And everybody's got some different thoughts on the new box, and it's great to get to dive in and sort of digest all those takes. You could be busy for a while, I feel like, with all the stuff that's been released in the last week.
Want to highlight there too, the Battle Mallet podcast. This is the first time that they've been able to join release day off of a preview copy. Which is another thing to be excited about. In the words of Davey, I hope your crew had access to some champagne bottles that you could smash over your monitors. As one does.
Oh, yes. As you do. I've got the stash of bubbly right here next to the computer, all ready to go. But yeah, so, beyond just what we're doing as a, community of content creators, we also got a really cool thing from Games Workshop. They have been doing for a while now a Metawatch series where game designers talk with folks from this Metawatch group and have videos basically talking about sort of what is going on in each of the different games in Games Workshop's sort of realm of games. So Age of Sigmar, 40K, Kill Team, I think, have all had these. And now we have one for Underworlds, which is really cool, for a number of different reasons. I personally am excited because it sort of shows that they're invested in Underworlds still. They're willing to make a YouTube video where they had fairly important individuals in the design of the game actually sitting down and intelligently talking about it and giving sort of a peek behind the curtain, as it were, into some of the strategies and thoughts about balancing the game. So absolutely excited to see more of it. And if you haven't watched it already, you can go and find it on Games Workshop's official site.
Yeah, I am equally excited. I think its mere existence speaks to the health of the game and the future of the game. I think it's the most candid and informational content we've gotten around Underworlds probably ever.
Yes.
And when I say candid, we even get spoiled for us that there are buffs on the way for Loon Court and for Velmorn. So a little tease there, and the candidness goes further than a tease into the future. Really kind of diving into the questions presented in really easy to understand and digest lingo, and I really enjoyed that sit down conversation style that it was all presented in.
Yeah, absolutely. And being that it was a conversation that you could tell that he actually knows what he's talking about, whereas sometimes you get the community articles and it's like, I don't think you know anything about Underworlds. Which is a nice change of pace to be like, yes, somebody who actually, knows our game, plays our game, understands the community, and what are the things that we're dealing with. So really, really cool.
Absolutely.
But I think that's it for news. Obviously, having had back-to-back episodes, we don't have as many news things to pull from as we usually do. So I think that's good, unless there's anything else that you think needs to be shouted out.
Everybody that put out day one content, heroes, all of you.
Yeah, of course. Oh, and I suppose I don't know that we've shouted it out enough, but the deck builder websites, all of you are true heroes in this community because I would venture to guess that 99% of people who build decks for this game use your content and you choose to give of your time freely to make these things so that we can use them. And you do so on incredibly short turnarounds. So kudos, and you are heroes.
Shout out Underworlds DB and Wonderworlds Club.
Yes, absolutely. All right, then. So, on to our main topic. We got lots of fish folk to talk about. Let's just dive right in. So, this warband is visually somewhat similar to what we saw in Soul Raid. But I think in terms of stats and abilities and playstyle, they feel pretty different. What was your take after reading through them the first time?
Yeah, so with Elthane Soul Raid, they have carved out an identity as invading aggro. And when I was reading these guys, I started to hesitate. I had this a predisposition that Ideneth are going to be invading aggro, just simply because I've only known one example so far. And
Right.
so I've been looking at them through the lens of invading aggro, and I'm like, I don't think they're going to be doing that.
Yeah.
Which we'll definitely be exploring more throughout the episode. And they have their beast-like additions to their team. Soul Raid having Duneclaw and Spinefin. Here we have Sephinir, this mighty squid that looks absolutely fantastic.
Yes.
And has tricks, as one would expect from a creature addition to an Ideneth team, reactionary tricks. We have a leader in Elethane and in Cyreni with comparable stat lines that really kind of remind you of each other and kind of invoke this idea of this is what now an Ideneth leader looks like, and thralls on the team, to round it out. So yeah, the similarities are there. The Inspire mechanic is another similarity, and now a new constant where we have an ebb and flow on when you're going to see Ideneth in general.
Yeah.
Reach inspiration, over the course of a game. It'll happen on the game's timer, and then they will actually uninspire as well. So when you're up against them, you're trying to, or if you're playing them, you're trying to manage the ebb and flow of that, which I think is really cool.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're both thinking, okay, they're probably not invading aggro. Let's go through these fighters sort of to lay a baseline so that everybody knows sort of where we're coming from, and then we can get into what we actually thought were the reasonings for what we think they actually will do well if it's not invading aggro. So Cyreni of the Abyss, this is their leader. She is a wizard. She's level 2 wizard. She has, similar to the rest of the sort of elf fighters, 4 move, 1 block. The wounds characteristics are different. She has 4. The thralls have 3, but they're pretty straightforward in terms of that basic stat block. That's stuff we've seen, not necessarily for elves, but as a pretty generic stat block for most of the game. And then her attack is a range 2 spell attack, which is a little different than what we're used to. Usually you'd expect 3, but it does do 2 damage, and it is using the focus characteristic. So this is very similar to having a staff or spear attack action, which I feel like on leaders we usually see range 2, 2 smash, 2 damage. But some interesting and different things going on with her. She has a special action, and I know that you have been pretty excited about this one. So how about you run this down for folks, Skyler?
So this is called Hammertide, and the action reads: place the scatter token in this fighter's hex. Draw a straight line from the center of the token in the direction indicated by the smash symbol. The first time this line enters a hex occupied by an enemy fighter, deal 1 damage to that enemy fighter, and stagger that fighter. And first off, when you read, put a scatter token on the board, your brain kind of immediately is like, oh, we're going to roll some dice. We're going to scatter. No. The reason we're putting a scatter token on the board is so that you can put a hammer on the board.
Putting the hammer down.
Draw a straight line from it, and you're going to laser damage out.
Yeah.
In our Deathgorge kind of like kickoff episode, I actually kind of speak to there being a way to block line of sight here. I don't 100% recall how I worded it, but I definitely implied like line of sight matters here, and it does not.
Yeah.
So that was kind of a mistake on the fly in the moment. But one of the things that's interesting about this is it's going through whatever's in front of it, whether that be friendly or blocked hexes, looking for that first enemy fighter.
Yeah, and so positioning then becomes really kind of a mini game against this warband, right? Because there's going to become these straight line alleyways, right? Where it's like, oh, if I stand anywhere here or here, I can get hammertided. But if I stand here, Cyreni has to move first. And since you can't charge in hammertide or move in hammertide without doing it in 2 actions, it becomes this thing of like, well, how am I going to position safely against this?
That's where the finesse of this warband starts.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah, I agree.
Because if you're playing against them, like you're constantly thinking about, am I landing myself in a position where I'm opening up a hammertide action? Which means on your side of the table, you can put your fighters in positions where, if charged, right, you're creating this window. So it's like, hey,
yeah,
feel free to, but just so you know, laser beam.
Yeah. Water lasers. And it would, I think, be quite punishing if it was just straight line ping, deal a damage. But that's stagger. I feel like this is going to set up a lot of situations where somebody is like out of position, and then you're like, okay, ping you, stagger you, next activation, I now have rerolls against your charged fighter who's not going to be able to get out of the way. And all of a sudden, it's like, ooh, that's a big change from what I maybe thought I had to all of a sudden you've got rerolls and I'm hurt and like, ooh, scary stuff.
Agree. And out the gate too. I know we brought this up during our breakdown episode, but like as soon as you start putting boards down too, you and starting to place fighters, you're thinking about the lanes that are being created. Yeah. If you or your opponent's positioning boards, you're kind of eyeing up, where starting hexes are going to line up against each other. And so that might influence how you decide to put boards down. From experience and from initial like giddy theory, longboarding with them is something that the Cyreni player absolutely wants to be doing, because we're limiting how few of positions I need to be in with Cyreni to have, these wide lanes or wide open lanes, right?
Yeah.
There's so many fewer of them, and they're, tightly packed together where I'm just pushing one away versus having to like push into an angle a few from where I currently stand. So you're thinking about it right at the beginning of the game when you're placing boards, when you're placing fighters. I know something I found myself as the one running Cyreni like deliberating over is like, I don't even know where to put my own fighters sometimes. It like if they could potentially line up with an enemy hex, I'm like, I need to save that one as an option for her. But that,
yeah,
as I'm saving her for last. But then you kind of have to give in and find like, okay, like I'm willing to give in and give up that position because I also need to keep my relatively squishy fighters a little safer.
Yeah. So I think ultimately what we are really trying to say is that Cyreni is going to be important to this warband, and you will probably design your entire strategy around this fighter, which isn't dissimilar from how wizard warbands have worked in the past, but it's a very different sort of strategy. So we'll
absolutely,
as we get to cards, we'll absolutely talk more about Cyreni, but I think it is important to understand just how critical hammertide is to the warband and how it affects just about every aspect of your game.
And I'm going to be pretty excited throughout the course of the episode to echo similarities to Elathane's Soul Raid. So Elathane is similarly important to that warband because like you have such massive accuracy with him during round 2. So you're playing this game of trying to like hold him back and keep him alive, but then also getting him into position for that entire round 2.
Yeah.
So you have, 2 Idoneth warbands now where their leaders are just playing these pivotal roles, and it's really cool to see.
Yeah, but in very different ways, right? So I like that they made sure that they have similar style. There's parts of their design that are stylistically similar, but they're built in such a way that even with those stylistic similarities, they're going to play differently. And I like that they did that, because you wouldn't necessarily want these to just be Soul Raid 2.0.
The reprisal. Yeah. No, they're fundamentally different, for sure.
Very much. So before we, I guess, go and start talking about her inspired side, let's just quick run down what actually is their inspired mechanic. And this one is, I'm going to read it, but then I think we can just sort of say a little bit,
summarize it from there,
because it's a little bit much. So if it is your third power step in round 1, your second power step in round 2, or your first power step in round 3, that is your inspire window. Yeah.
And then your uninspire window is at the end of the round. Uninspire this fighter.
Yeah. So that's how you inspire your fighter. Once they flip over, they all have this title, is what it's called, rule, just like Skyler said, at the end of the round, uninspire. So the timing basically is just always moved back moved up 1 power step. So
exactly,
third, you'll inspire, which it is important to note, in your power step is when this triggers.
Correct.
Not just the third power step in a round. It has to be your third power step. So if you go second, your inspire comes later.
Which means anytime you go first in a round, you'll get to enjoy any defensive boon that your fighters receive a little longer in that given round.
Yeah.
A way to kind of hold this inspire in your head that's been working for me is, if it's round 1, you're going to get 1 activation with your inspiration. If it's round 2, round 3, you're going to get a full 3 activations with your inspire. So if you think about it that way, then it helps you understand how it's facilitated, right? So if I'm going to have 1 activation in round 1, well, then I'm going to inspire after my 3rd, so that my 4th is the 1 I get in round 1. Yep.
Absolutely. And since it is an inspire that triggers in the power step, you don't... What is the next inspire window? Is there an inspire window in the power step?
Not in, but immediately after.
Okay, so, yeah.
Yeah. Following an activation, you have reaction, inspire, surge, but also following a power step, you have reaction, inspire, surge.
Yeah, that's what I thought. So it's important then to note as well, if you have power cards that care about fighters being inspired or uninspired, hint, they do, the timing on that does matter. And you are going to need to be careful that, like, you don't accidentally think, oh, I'm in this power step, therefore they're inspired, so now I'm going to do the thing. No. Basically, you'll have a similar number of power steps in which fighters will be inspired to the number of actions that you get, similar to how Skyler was explaining it. So,
absolutely.
Tricky.
And that's going to matter a lot in Rivals and Nemesis.
Absolutely. I think it's a lot to just keep track of at first. Well, I think once you get used to it, it's like, okay, yeah, I see how this works, and it's like more intuitive, but just looking at it and reading it, you're like, wait a minute, when does all this happen? So I think important to spend the time on it now before we dive more into their strategy, but just hopefully that's clear enough. When Cyreni does inspire, not a huge change, moving up to speed 5, which is not the norm for the rest of the warband. So the speed boost is something to keep in mind. And then she does also switch over to channel from focus. So she is slightly more accurate, but that is the extent of her changes.
Yeah, and I think those are fine. I think they're modest, but welcome, while not overshadowing the importance of the hammertide action there.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it shows that for at least for Cyreni, you are not probably really worried about the Inspire all that much. You probably feel pretty good about activating Cyreni just whenever you have the opportunity to do so, whether she's inspired or not.
Agree.
That then brings us into the Thralls, or the twins as I like to think about them, or potentially Thing 1 and Thing 2. Skyler, would you like to run down their basic stats?
Absolutely. So, as stated before, they are on 4 movement with 1 shield, the both of them, and 3 wounds. Then they're on their uninspired side, sharing the same attack profile. They both have a spear. They have a range 2, 2 smash, 2 damage attack. And that's it. So, as Phil stated, Thing 1, Thing 2.
Yeah.
The differences come alive when they inspire.
Yeah. And in terms of having 2 reach to 2 damage fighters right out the gate, that's not bad at all, right? I mean,
oh, absolutely. Absolutely not bad.
Yeah, no, not at all. It's like, I feel like I've been terrorized by Manok and Tough Skull multiple times where it's just like, oh man, these guys can both just kind of chill and take swings at me and I can't do anything about it.
They kind of start building this glass cannon picture for me because they have a threat range of 6 out the gate. They have the ability to stand at that reach 2 when they attack you, right? So they're not granting you, in most cases, if I'm picking my targets well, they're not granting you the ability to just attack me back, whether I failed or succeeded at my attack. You're probably going to have to close that distance with a charge or a push, or similar. So they're able to reach out at you with that threat range of 6, but to compensate for that, they're on 3 wounds with 1 shield out the gate. So if you've got somebody in your warband that can flex up to that 3 damage right away and are throwing multiple dice, and you're able to just land 2 successes on me, they'll start feeling pretty glass pretty quickly.
Yeah.
And I like that balancing act here. It's definitely something to get used to. I've been playing elves as long as I've been playing Underworlds, and this is pretty typical for elvish players. You adapt constantly to losing fighters, and anytime you risk one out, you kind of clench and hope they survive, and you're delighted when it's like, oh,
yeah,
they did live. I love it when they do that.
Yeah, it's sort of that like hope for the best but plan for the worst kind of a game plan, right?
Yep, absolutely.
Yeah. So, as you mentioned, as they inspire, their stats do change. So, I really appreciate that the 2 fighters sort of fill different roles once they're inspired. So, Alethir inspires to gain cleave on the regular spear attack. So just a little more accurate. But then also picks up a whirling blade, which has scything. It's 2 fury for 2 damage, which 2 damage on scything is scary, at least in my opinion. So when you're facing hordes, you probably are going to value Alethir more highly.
Agree. Or armored targets.
Yeah. If you're trying to take out lots of block fighters. On the flip side, Renglaith is just going for Grievous. So Renglaith is going to be hitting harder. So you probably care more about Renglaith surviving when you have high wound fighters that you have to deal with.
Agree. Yeah, and his profile there knocks up to 3 fury.
Yeah.
Again, coming from 2 smash.
Yeah.
So giving you the extra dice to help you try to hit that Grievous result.
Yeah, which is really nice because it's still at reach 2. So it gives you a little bit of accuracy boost, but critically that extra die. I like both fighters inspired. I think, you know, you will structure your game plan differently for your opponents, and you kind of have to know like which one you need from, I think, turn 1, activation 1. At least that was my sense reading the cards the first time and playing against them.
Mine as well. Yeah, I think you're going to find Alethyr is commonly your problem solver.
Yep.
And the one that you want to protect. So you're probably going to play a little more riskier with Renglaith, but it'll be important to not fall into habit and recognize when you want to make that trade.
Yeah.
When you realize like, oh, I'm actually really going to want that spike to 3 damage potential.
Yeah. I mean, there's a few different scenarios where I would want the 3 damage more. The most obvious is like I'm facing somebody like Mollog, where I just want to put down as much damage as I possibly can. I don't want it to have to be, you know, chipping away 2 to get to 7. It's like I'd like to be able to throw 3s so that I can do it in fewer attacks, kind of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, that particular example, it's like if you can get at least 1 3 in there,
yeah,
you've cut, you know, the action requirement down by 1. If you can get 2 in there, hey, then you can just safely hammertide that 7th one down.
And then I think the other situation is 4 and 5 wound fighters, where you could even be putting damage upgrades out and then be setting up Renglaith into a situation where you could be one-shotting even 4 wound fighters. So,
agree.
Yeah, they're your Swiss Army knife. Combined, you can answer just about any problem. So keep them at the ready. And they do also have a cool secondary rule. We've seen this before. They pick up what's called Unshakable. They don't count as on guard, but they do count rolls of dodge as successes. So they kind of get half of guard. Not a huge defense boost, but we'll take it, right?
Agree. Yeah, this ends up being pretty mild, but I like that it offers you some survivability against cleave attacks.
Yeah. Anything else you think needs saying about Renglaith and Alethyr?
I think that's pretty covered. The one thing for those that were looking at the models and theorizing, you know, what those models might indicate, there is a lantern in the hands of Renglaith. Keep that in mind. It's an upgrade. We'll get back to it.
Yeah. Also, a handy dandy way to keep track of which one is which, because they otherwise look pretty much identical.
Reminds me of, like, it's more distinct than this, but whenever I'm playing against Draper's Wraith Creepers, I have to look for the bird.
Yeah.
And it's like, if I see the bird, beak means cleave. Kill that one to protect my block fighters.
Yeah. They are subtly different. Pretty tough. You know, and you know what? The other ghosts actually are all pretty subtly different too. But we digress. We have a squid to talk about here.
Absolutely.
You know, what everyone has been waiting for, I'm sure. Skyler, how about you tell the world about Sephinir?
Oh boy, let's get cracking. So, first off, the keyword he dons is hunter, and Sephinir is also a flyer. A flyer at 5 move, 1 dodge, and 4 wounds on his uninspired side, with an attack named Rending Limbs.
Yeah.
And this starts at range 1, 3 dice looking for fury, dealing 2 damage. But what is the star of the show is the signature ability here called Phase Ink. And this is a reaction after an attack action that targeted this fighter. Stagger up to 1 visible enemy fighter within 2 hexes, and then place this fighter on a hex within 1 hex of no one's territory, and more than 1 hex from each enemy fighter. And there's a lot to break down there.
Yeah. So when I first read this, I was like, oh, that's cool. You know, it gives him a way to sort of get out of danger when somebody charges in on him, so you can hopefully make sure that he's not just gonna get ganged up on or whatever. That is a wild underestimation of what it is like dealing with this ability. So from one of the games that we played, I was in a situation where I got to use
Is it a icon of access?
Yeah, Icon of Excess is what it's called. I was trying to think of the name. Basically, if you succeed in casting a spell, you can then make a move or attack with all your fighters. Um, really, really good, by the way. But I was in a situation where I was trying to get down Sephinir. So I was like, well, I've got reach 2 attacks. I have reach on Sephinir for multiple fighters. So I'll start with this one. And then I swung and I missed. And then he's like, okay, I'm going to phase ink. And then staggered my fighter and teleported to a spot where I wasn't in range anymore. And I was like, oh, wait a minute. That's annoying and disruptive. And now what do I do? And that kept coming up. It kept happening where I was like, I didn't expect that. I didn't expect that positioning. Oh no, now I'm staggered. What am I doing? What is going on? So I would just say, don't underestimate how big of an impact this repositioning can be, because it can be like you're going from one side of the board to the other, or you can be like just jumping just a couple hexes away. So or like, I'm going to go sit on an objective because despite being a squid, he is not a beast, so he can hold objectives. And so it's like you could accidentally let your opponent hold an extra objective off of this. So yeah, lots of things that I was unpleasantly surprised playing against it.
So hammertide is fantastic, like no question about it. And the potential to look at your opponent and say, stop, it's hammertide.
Yep.
Really increases that.
You have to.
Thank you, listener Jake, by the way. Hangs out in our Discord and was like, I cannot wait to shout this at my opponents and watch them die inside a little.
Yeah. Hopefully they actively just quit right there.
But with as great and unique as hammertide is, and how much you can do with that, this actually stole the show for me. This is my favorite ability that the warband comes baked in with, for sure. I'm going to jump into the inspire side before I gush about it too much more, because it kind of helps build this picture. When Sephinir inspires, Sephinir moves up to 2 dodge. Sephinir also gains a extra dice on rending limbs, bringing it up to 4 fury, and ensnare. So that means that this warband actually ends up with sources for both cleave and ensnare innately, which is really cool to see, and another echo over to Soul Raid. But looking back at that 2 dodge that you gain, that increases your chance to not take any damage when you're targeted, and get that phasing off, which it doesn't actually even have to target the person that targeted you. Like if there's another fighter within 2 of Sephinir when targeted, like you can just choose that one and then blink away.
Absolutely.
It's fantastic.
Yeah, it's really, there's so many possible opportunities for this that trying to like fully game plan for it, either with it in your warband or against it, is really hard until you've seen it a number of times, because it's just like, oh man, there's like this whole matrix spreadsheet type thing of like, if I go down this path, I could be doing all these things. Or if I go down this path, and it's just like, oh my God, how am I going to ever be able to predict what's going to happen? And I think that like, that is how this is supposed to feel. And I feel like they nailed it. Like it's just pure confusion, and it's almost impossible to predict.
Agree. And the value of it increases if you can get a ranged weapon on Sephinir, because again, Sephinir is not a beast.
Yes.
So Sephinir can be a total weapon caddy.
Absolutely.
If you can get range 2 or higher on, then when you blink and you fulfill that requirement of blinking in, 1 hex away from a fighter,
still attack.
You're still open for the attack.
It's pretty crazy. I think having mechanics like this in the game is one of those things that I think lends itself well to a high skill ceiling. Everybody's going to use this. People who understand it well will use it well. And people who understand this well and understand all the different synergies that it can have in the game are going to take it to like this really high level where they can do things that people weren't expecting and turn games like on their head, because they know, you know, if I do this, that, and the other thing, and I get to reposition here, then all of a sudden it opens up this strategy. And it's like, oh man, I love that. So really cool. Not something we get to see very often in fighters in different warbands. But they are just the 4-fighter warband. That is all of them. Do you have any other final thoughts about the fighters specifically, or anything more generically about the warband before we start talking about strategies?
I think that about covers it from a general standpoint.
All right.
Let's dive into game plan.
Yeah. So what is this warband trying to do? What are they good at? So I'll ask it this way. When you first looked at them, what did you think? And then after you played with them a time or two, what did you think?
Yeah, so the first time I sat down to play with them, I noticed that they had a ton of stagger support and incentive to lean into stagger. So they actually have in-house 2 objectives that are looking at stagger. One that is a surge for 2 glory, and it's looking for 3 or more surviving enemy fighters, each to have 1 or more stagger tokens. And this is called sensory deprivation. It's also flexible in the sense that this is a hybrid, and it says, or 3 or more enemy fighters are out of action. So initially, I thought that the 3 stagger was pretty enticing, especially given that we have stagger built into hammertide and we have stagger built into phase ink. So with a little bit of support, which they have in their power deck, I thought that was a really enticing 2 glory surge. And then just seeing the flexibility there kind of like made it a sure in to like my build ideology, where it's like, and it's flexible where like if I need to just take fighters down, I can score it that way. Absolutely. Like you've reduced the investment, the risk of, you know, making sure that I can get that stagger payoff by offering me this other way to score it. So that is a highly potent surge in their deck, sensory deprivation. And then they have a glory end phase, single glory end phase called mind erosion. Score this in an end phase if 1 or more enemy fighters each have 1 or more stagger tokens. So I see this. I see 3 glory for stagger. I see 2 fighters that can support it. Some great power cards that can do so as well. And I kind of just was like, I guess for my first game, I'm going to lean into that and, you know, kind of explore. Since then, before I go since then, how about you? You know, you're looking at them for your first time, you're playing them for your first time. What do you think?
Yeah. So I was thinking that, you know, they were described as being aggro, but I looked at their stats and I went, this is not an aggro warband. Or at the very least, if it is an aggro warband, they are one that is going to die. Which is fine. There can be aggro warbands that don't care about dying, but this didn't feel like that. I was like, I don't think I want either Alethyr or Renglith to just charge forward and get dead. That feels really bad. I definitely don't want Cyreni dead. And that leaves Sephinir, and it's like, I don't, like, yeah, he's kind of got wounds, but 4 wounds goes away in a hurry, and that 1 dodge on his uninspired side, that's not like looking big and tanky to me. So I quickly got off the idea that these were going to be aggro, and I started to notice that they do actually have a number of things that care about holding objectives.
They do indeed.
So they have a end phase called Inexplicable Dread, where they're saying you hold 1 or more objectives, and one of those objectives is in no one's or an enemy territory. And then they also have Quota of Souls, which is your warband holds 2 or more objectives within 1 hex of no one's territory, or 3 or more enemy fighters out of action. You see that again.
Ooh, that flexibility.
Yeah. And so the thought that came to mind for me immediately was like, well, we've got multiple ranged fighters and a fighter who can teleport around midline. Maybe this is a flex warband where you need to move forward and make some attacks, but you don't necessarily have to be like a full all the way in warband. So my thought was, you're gonna like sort of move up to camp midline and then hope that you can just sort of poke your opponents from there. But admittedly, I didn't feel great about that because holding the midline is not as easy as it sounds. You're still pretty vulnerable doing that. So
Agree.
that was where I was at.
I love where your first impressions are at because we're both speaking to what we're seeing in the objective deck. And that's very often how you describe and begin to understand a warband's game plan.
Yeah.
Is, what does their objective deck speak to? What are they trying to do? And you could summarize this objective deck in 3 themes. You have staggering, you have hold. They have essentially a reprint of Path to Order in their deck, or Path of Order. And that card is called Means of Survival. Your warband holds 2 or more objectives, and 2 or more enemy fighters are out of action. So that's like the other hold piece they have in there. And then the final theme that would round out in 3 themes their objective deck is just taking fighters out of action. They have like 3 surges that are looking for it, arguably a 4th one in 3 hammertide actions being done. That's a surge. It's looking for like a combination here. Actually, let me just read that one. That's Rising Threat. Surge. Score this immediately after your warband's 3rd or subsequent hammertide action and or cast spell in the same phase. So it ends up kind of arguably falling in, dealing damage, taking fighters out of action because you're casting spells and hammertide's dealing damage. But frankly, it's one of the few objectives that kind of stands out on its own, where they have, I think their hardest objective is Soul Harvesters. Score this in an end phase if more enemy fighters are out of action than friendly fighters are out of action. So I knew that was something I wanted to lean away from right away because with how weak you are, you have to have really surgical strikes and then survive said surgical strikes to make sure that you can get Soul Harvesters going. But what do you think about that kind of in 3 themes breakdown where we're looking at stagger, hold, and a lot that's looking for out of action fighters?
Yeah. You absolutely have those 3 themes. I think that the 3 themes are actually less disparate than they maybe seem. Potential exception being, something like Tsunami Strike, I think, is a weird outlier here where you're taking a fighter out of action in enemy territory specifically, which is a very aggressive thing to be doing, whereas the rest of the deck is very flexy, where it's like, I don't necessarily want to be all the way in enemy territory. And it's like, I want to hold some objectives. So I feel like that one's a weird outlier, but it is important to note that, and this is not something I queued into right away, but it does allow for picking up the kill, not just with attacks. So if you have other ways to do that, you can use pings, you can push people into lethals, whatever, and it'll still trigger. So it's not entirely like disparate to the rest of the strategies.
Agree. Yeah. So after like the initial games, I started finding that the identity they were carving out in my mind is more this KG playstyle. It's the best term I kind of have to describe it, where you're going to spend initial turns of the game holding back. And part of the finesse of this warband is figuring out when to put somebody forward, who that is, because hammertide actually lends itself really well to being your opener, to giving you the chance to play reactionarily to your opponent. I think that's the number one thing this warband wants to do, is they want to sit back and react to you. They definitely don't want to be the one kicking off the tempo and giving you that reactionary action or activation against them, right? If I go first and I lunge in, then even if I survive that first activation, you have 3 more to handle who I put forward, right? So the more I can decrease how much time you have to try to take down my warband, the better I'm going to do. So I find that you want to play a lot of hold back. I think they're going to excel whenever they're able to like hold two objectives in the back and force you to come to them and then react in that way.
I definitely agree. An interesting note that I didn't even really cue into until we were just going through the fighter cards again just now. That idea of needing to hold back and then charge, or the hold back and then get aggressive, it's mirrored in their Inspire condition. The early parts of the game, you're going to be sitting back, prepping, planning, waiting. Now you're inspired, go. And then you start it over, but you don't have to wait as long. And then you go.
Precisely.
And then finally you get to the final round. And if you can keep them all alive until the very final round, I think you're going to be finding that you have a lot of flexibility in what you can do and a lot of power to work with, because their inspired sides are pretty good. I'm not going to say they're like super, super strong, but like they're definitely better than their uninspired side. So I agree. I think that you do want to hold back. I think you want to wait. I think you want to try and draw your opponents to you as much as possible. And I think your instincts with the stagger and hold stuff lends itself really well to that, because you can stagger fighters without having to go and get in their face. And by doing that, you can be scoring a little bit of glory as you go and hopefully disrupting their strategy through power cards, and then finally coming in to try and clean up or get on objectives.
Agree. Yeah, and I think they have such a well-rounded offering across their fighters that they're going to be fairly flexible in what you can pair them with. So really excited to explore that with you later. To highlight one thing coming later is when I first read Sephinir and where he's landing off that phase ink, that's where Fearsome Fortress lives. So then seeing objectives that are looking to potentially hold one or two in Fearsome Fortress territory, to know that there's stagger here, it kind of started coming up as this natural synergy for me as like a starting point in either Nemesis or Championship. And I'd love to explore that a little more later, but I kind of wanted to just bring it up now to kind of speak to them as a game plan, because if you're going that route, you're holding back and biding your time for when you're going to land your fighters in those positions, and you're using phase ink to help you get essentially a free positioning into that environment.
Yeah. For sure. I think, we will definitely discuss some of the pairings and what we think they work well with. To that end though, so let's try and just say, so if you're looking at the objectives, since we talked about, that's sort of how you start to construct your strategy. What are your must-haves that inform what your strategy is going to be? I think we already said sensory deprivation. That feels like an auto include. It's a surge for 2. It's relatively doable, right?
Agree.
Yeah. Where do you look to next? What is the next thing that you're like, this is my must take from their faction cards?
My next must take is another surge called Snuff Out. And what makes Snuff Out great is, first let me read it. Surge. Score this immediately after your warband deals precisely enough damage to an enemy fighter to take that fighter out of action. This is not an attack action.
Yeah.
It can be, but it's not limited to an attack action. And it's not like their other surges that are looking for fighters to be taken out of action. It's not territory restricted either.
Yeah.
So that one stands out as the best of 3 kill surges in the stack.
Agreed. And it is not passive, obviously, because you're killing, but the fact that you can do it with pings, the fact that you can do it with hammertide, there's just a lot of situations that you can make this happen in. We've seen other surges very similar to this, where it's an attack action that deals precisely enough damage, and those are still usually good enough to take, at least in Nemesis, if not in Championship. And this is that with a few extra ways to score it. So I agree, this is a good one. So we have 2 strong surges at this point. And then I would say the next one that I look to is that I'm like, okay, well, what about your end phases? And I'm looking at either means of survival or quota of souls as sort of the next like must take, because they're your 2 glories that are actually doable. But then it just becomes the question of which one's easier. You know, on the one hand, one is saying you need to hold objectives within 1 hex of no one's territory. So like you said, this starts to lean you in that direction of, holding in the middle. But it also has that opt out clause, whereas means of survival is an and clause where you need to do both things. So personally, I'm leaning quota of souls. And I think if you take those 3 as sort of like, these are your must haves, because I don't know, do you have any others in here that are like, I have to have this?
Yeah. Is a 1 glory end phase. It's mind erosion.
Oh, sure. Yeah. Have 1 fighter staggered.
Yep. Absolutely. Like, so you have that reliable, whether it's round 1 or round 3 end phase, and you want your 1 glory to be as reliable as possible, especially as early as possible.
Yeah. I mean, obviously we would prefer that all of our end phases be for 2 glory, but sometimes you just need that seed glory, right?
Agree. And I think with means of survival, the call out there, you're able to hold 2, so wherever you'd like.
Yeah.
But you have to have that 2 or more enemy fighters out of action. I think this ends up being, if you bring it, you're leaning into this as, something that's going to score for you in rounds 2 or 3. And it becomes riskier because that means I don't think this is a inexperienced player pick for this warband. Like, I think if this is your first time playing with this warband and you're building your first pairing, this probably makes the cutting floor until you decide if it matches a play style that you're comfortable with them. Because if you lose 2 fighters in round 1 and then in rounds 2 or 3 lose another one, then you might not be able to hold 2 objectives at the same time you finally crossed over that 2 or more enemy fighters are out of action line.
Yeah.
So I think it has a place. Like, right. I don't think it's, a card you strictly leave at home, but I think it's one that you want some play experience informing whether or not that's going to work for you. And that's what you want to like plan and build towards.
Yeah. I totally agree. And I think that, we'll find that through experimentation, people will find probably a lot of different ways to play this warband, a lot of different pairings for it. But if I'm looking at this and I'm saying, okay, we've got mind erosion, quota of souls, sensory deprivation, and snuff out is like my bedrock. That's where I'm starting pretty much every deck. I'm just saying, get them in there because I know I can score these reliably some way. I'm feeling pretty good about that, and it gives me a lot of flexibility.
I am too.
Yeah. So I'm liking that, and it, we're already starting to sort of see that little bit of glimmer just from Quota of Souls. It's like, hey, maybe you want to hold near the middle line, but even if you can't make that happen, you still have these other options. So I think we have given a good rundown of the overall strategy based on what we're seeing in the objectives and why we think we can go those directions. What about the gambits? What in the gambits helps to support what we've already thought this playstyle should be?
So, speaking to tools that are going to assist with your game plan, a particularly spicy card is Spiteful Riptide.
Yeah.
This is inspired friendly fighters. So note right out of the gate, this is gated on when you're inspired. So you're managing, whether or not you're like, for example, if you draw this in round 1, is this something you keep or is this something you mulligan? Because you're going to have 3 uninspired activations. You're going to get less fuel out of this. So you have this pull on some of these power cards as to when they're going to provide you with the most value that you're going to have to manage. But to run this one down, its inspired friendly fighters have the flying trait. After a friendly fighter's move action, stagger each enemy fighter whose hex that fighter moved through. This effect persists until the end of the round. Oh my gosh, Phil, I just realized something about this card I had not realized until this moment. Did you pick it up?
Well, without knowing what you're thinking about, I probably can't quite guess as to what it is that maybe I would have missed before.
No mind reading here? Okay. So, inspired friendly fighters have the flying trait, right? Awesome. That was my preamble here of, you're going to be managing, when that has the most effect for you.
Yep.
But then there's a period. And it goes on to say, after a friendly fighter's move action, stagger each enemy fighter whose hex that fighter moved through. This effect persists until the end of the round. That means this card can work for you turn 1, round 1 with Sephenir and his flying movement of move 5. Like, he can...
So I had thought about that. Does this fall foul of the you need to be able to complete all aspects of the card?
I mean,
you have no inspired friendly fighters, so
I think you can prime this. This effect persists until the end of the round. Like, at some point in time, you're going to have inspired friendly fighters. I don't think you run into a restriction here where it's like you must be able to convert somebody to a flyer right now.
Maybe.
I think we're good here.
I have thought that for so many cards where I'm like, well, surely I don't have to be able to do this to be able to play the card. And then people are like, no, you absolutely do. And it's like, oh, okay. I guess the one that comes to mind immediately is there's the upgrade from Beastbound Assault. I don't remember what it's called. The names don't mean anything to me, but it's like a little grub guy on your shoulder, and it's like heal a friendly fighter 1, period.
Mm-hmm.
Then push a friendly fighter, up to 1 hex. And it's like, they seem like 2 separate abilities, but it's like, no, you have to be able to heal to push.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. So in that case, you you'll know immediately, right? Like, I'm not getting a heal down. Whereas this, blankets the field with inspired friendly fighters.
Because it's persisting, you think because it's not a specific fighter that's the reasoning?
Yeah, I think so. Like, if this had said,
I can buy that.
Choose a friendly fighter or choose a friendly or an inspired friendly fighter.
Yeah. Okay.
Then I think we'd be there. But I think with this blanket statement, we're
persists, good. So maybe you can just leave it out. Okay.
Yeah.
I'm willing to accept that interpretation. I had thought about it, so I guess I had read your mind, but I had just thought, oh, this won't work because you can't do all the pieces of the card, because if you don't have any inspired fighters, how can you make anybody have flying? But
listeners, if you have an argument one way or the other, please let us know.
And Games Workshop, if you're listening, and we'll probably send you an email later, please just get rid of that rule. Just it makes reading the cards so hard. There's times where it's like, wait, can I do this? Can I not do this? Like, make it cleaner to say these are the conditions in which you can play the card, or they're not, and like have it end there. Like, obviously we cleared up the heal thing. It's like, if you can't remove wound tokens, you can't heal, but there's still like so many cards that have multiple clauses, and they're like, oh, but if you can't finish one of the 3 things that the card does, you can't play the card at all. And it's like, why do we have to do that? It doesn't make any sense to me. It's logically makes cards complicated when they don't probably need to be. But anyway, I digress. It's still a really cool card. It's doing a lot of things for you. Go on, Skyler.
Yeah, even despite not realizing, that this I think has the ability to allow you to do this with Sephenir earlier than you see an inspired fighter. I was already bringing this in my deck, because even if I'm held back to when I'm inspired, running somebody through a fighter on my way to another fighter and staggering that one, and then potentially also staggering my target if I can get through them as well before attacking them. all of that's great. Like even if I can just stagger the one I'm running through before I turn around and attack it, like I think this card has a lot of value, especially given that you're going to have 6 activations in the game. Is how that breaks down, right?
Yeah.
1, 2, and then 3. So you're spending 6 activations inspired. So 6 activations where this could really be of benefit to you.
Yeah. And it is important to note it is not after a fighter's activation in which they make a move action. So if you find ways to make moves outside of an activation, this will still trigger. So just something to keep in mind. It probably won't come up a ton outside of Championship based on what we're thinking the pairings would probably look like for Nemesis, but I think it's a good thing to keep in your back pocket. Trick you might pull out.
Agree. Yeah. So I have a favorite gambit. We were talking about gambits that, specifically kind of help us with our game plan.
Mm-hmm.
But there's just one I'm dying to talk
okay.
about.
Well, let's get it out of there.
And first off, I need to admit out loud that this is a spell.
Magic. he said it, folks.
Oh, gosh. This is a spell that I like and am hyped about. I'm playing with magic. What is wrong with me? Who am I? All right. So this is called Momentary Vortex.
Yeah.
And this, for those familiar with Center of Attention, is Center of Attention in spell form. And that reads, Gambit spell, one channel for casting. If cast, choose a fighter and push each other fighter that is within 2 hexes of the chosen fighter 1 hex so that they are closer to that fighter in an order you choose. If a fighter cannot be pushed in that way, do not push that fighter.
Yeah.
I love this card so much. I could gush all day about the applications of Center of Attention, the fact that you aren't limited to choosing your own fighter, that you can choose an enemy fighter. What that has meant in the time I played with Center of Attention is you can use it to pull fighters off of objectives going into end phase and really disrupt hold game plans and scoring. This can help you set up supports. This can help you set up scything. This card has so much utility.
Absolutely. Anybody who's played with Center of Attention before should already be familiar with a lot of the different tricks here. I think 2 keynotes. One, being a spell, it does have a slight additional restriction that Center of Attention doesn't have, in that choosing a fighter with a cast spell does require line of sight to that fighter. This is a fairly minor restriction, but it is a restriction, and blocked hexes are going to be more prevalent in this season because they can be placed at will after a plunder or with power cards. So keep that in mind. Somebody could block you from using this.
Very, very good note.
Not probably going to come up a lot, but it will come up sometimes, and it may come up in just the wrong moment and cripple your game plan. But then the other thing that I think is really cool with this, and is just something that usually a warband can leverage to make Center of Attention better, is when they have a fighter whose positioning is tricky or can be unexpected. And Sephonir is that personified. Like, if somebody is thinking, oh, I'm positioned well, I'm not in danger, and they attack Sephonir, and then you can reposition Sephonir into a spot where you will have a very disruptive momentary vortex, you could really catch somebody out. And I do think that is very important to keep in mind, both playing this warband and playing against them, is that if you need a fighter to be able to set up your momentary vortexes, Sephonir might be the one to do it.
Agree. Really good call out.
Yeah.
Because all of a sudden he can blink in and disrupt an area that you thought was completely safe.
Yeah. I do think it's worth noting that along with that, there is another sort of synergy card with Sephonir, Lurking Presence. This is a push 2, but it's only for Sephonir. Strangely, they decided to write this in such a way that it is not a restricted card. It's just, it requires that you have Sephonir to push, because it says push a friendly Sephonir. So you can't salvage it, which is frustrating.
If this card had said salvage, it would have made it into
it's still going to go in every single one of their decks, but it's just sort of one of those weird things where like it can still end up being a completely dead card.
Agree. And I personally find the ability to include a restriction on the bottom of a card and give it access to salvage, I find that to be an interesting way to balance a card.
Yeah.
There could have been an iteration of this card where it was salvageable, and in design and playtesting, they decided, hey, that pushes this card a little too far over the power curve than what we want. So we're going to leave it at this powerful push of, up to 2 hexes, but we're going to take away its ability to be salvaged.
Yeah. Yeah. And while I do think that it would be cool to be able to salvage this, it is very important to note that a push 2 in any direction with no like contingency on where you land is extremely powerful. So I'm not saying the card's not bad. It was just an interesting note. This is very, very flexible. This will set up a whole bunch of things that you can do. This will allow you to get onto objectives unexpectedly. I think it's a must take. I mean, if I see push 2, I immediately am going to be interested in the card, no matter what the restriction is. And this basically is a almost no restriction. So love it a lot.
Speaking of unexpected movement, we have another spell. Oh gosh. Okay. Called Countercurrent, which summons to mind Countercharge. And if it does for you, then you're already in line with what this card is going to have to offer for you.
Yeah.
So this is a Gambit spell reaction. 1 channel, once again. Play this after an enemy fighter's move action. If cast, choose a friendly fighter not adjacent to that enemy fighter. The chosen fighter makes a move action that must end within 2 hexes of the enemy fighter. One of the things I like about this is the flexibility to end within 2 hexes of that enemy fighter, kind of speaking to their spears in their profile. So they don't necessarily have to come in and hug the charging fighter or the fighter that has just moved. But that's an option. If you want the additional support, like let's say it is a charge and not just a flat move, you can bring that in a little closer to make sure that you're reducing the probability that they're able to land that attack by increasing your defensiveness. Countercharge is great, and this is extremely flexible in the sense that it's after an enemy fighter's move action, and that you're able to really get flexibility on where that placement, that landing spot is going to be.
Yeah. This is sort of another situation where you could unexpectedly be on an objective, right? It's like a 2 hex bubble gives you a fairly big, area in which you can be. So it's not a completely free move like we see in some decks, but it's close. Like you'll end up in a lot of places you want to be if you can use this. So I do like that. I think that for some of the like hold near the midline and get your fighters moved around into positions sort of late where you're like holding back and now I can finally move. This feels like it synergizes with that perfectly.
And almost failed to mention here that Hammertide loves this as well, right?
Yeah.
All of a sudden, you can completely reposition, and when you have that 2 hex bubble, like that repositioning is completely open as to where you're going to be able to land Hammertide in your next activation.
Yeah. Something that Davey had called out on the blog, which I think we should just mention here, because it is within 2 hexes, you could position your fighter around a blocked hex and make sure that it blocks line of sight. It's niche, but if you've ever been caught out by a maneuver that stops a charge, and of course in this case that charge would have to be a range 2 or 3 attack, but being able to reposition the fighter being charged because of that, you can't move the fighter if they're adjacent, but if like they didn't land adjacent to you, you could then tuck them away behind a blocked hex. Like that's pretty brutal. it's a situation that won't come up much, but man, if you pull it off, you'll probably ruin your opponent's game plan. So,
and you'll feel real good in the
yeah,
moment.
I'm sure you will. So definitely keep that in mind as an option, as many people will probably at least experiment with placing blocked hexes in this season.
Agree. Are there any other gambits that you would like to highlight that either speaks to their game plan or speaks to you personally?
So there's a few others that I really like, but I think the only other one that from the cards that we sort of pointed out, the only other one that I feel like really strongly synergizes is one called I will just mention quickly, there is a spell, Steed of Tides, which does synergize well with what we were calling out, but it does require double channels to cast. So I don't think it's worth talking about too much, because the variability becomes a big problem unless you want to be investing in spellcasting to the point where like you're going to have rerolls or some extra spell level or something, because it just becomes really difficult to guarantee that these are effects you can use reliably.
Agree. So what is this muse? Well, what has you here?
So the one that I think still synergizes well, it's called Resurfacing Memory. And this is just a gambit. You say, choose an enemy fighter within 2 hexes of one or more, because they just wanted to make sure there was no window for messing this up somehow, uninspired friendly fighters, and you just stagger them. Now, I will say, most of the rest of the cards that we haven't mentioned already do have a restriction to whether they're inspired or not inspired. And I think that those make these less useful gambits. But when you are already leaning into a strategy that wants to be able to just have stagger tokens on the board, having a gambit that can just do it and do it at 2 hexes away is pretty valuable. And as you already mentioned, we have our end phase, Mind Erosion, that we want to be able to have early in the game to be able to pick up a stagger and get this scored. This is an easy way to do it. And in round 1, you have the most opportunity. So I like it as a card. If we're leaning into stagger, I think you try and take it. Maybe it doesn't make the cut in Championship, but then again, in Championship, you can potentially also lean more heavily into stagger. So it's one that I like. I think it's close to the edge, though. I don't know that you always take it, but it fits the synergy of what we're sort of looking at as a sort of go-to strategy for these guys.
Yeah, you've hit that on the head as far as how I feel about it as well. Yeah, there are 5 gambits in this deck that look at whether they're inspired or uninspired and speak specifically to those timings, right? And so with that, you kind of have to evaluate how worthwhile that card is for you if you're drawing into it in the moments where you're not going to be meeting that. And the uninspired is a little trickier for me, because as the game progresses, I'm going to see that less and less.
Yeah.
They have, particularly, this is going to be a really good card for them in Rivals and potentially in Nemesis. Surging Stream, +1 damage to range 1 and range 2 attack actions made by uninspired friendly fighters. This effect persists until the end of the round, or an uninspired friendly fighter makes 1 or more attack actions. And I just want to bring that up because that's, some in-house +1 damage.
Yeah, it's never bad.
Yeah. They only get 1 crack at it. It's not looking for a successful, attack coming from an uninspired friendly fighter, which I reckon kind of pushes the power level even further, on this. So I'm not surprised to not see it looking for a successful attack here, that you are only getting the 1 crack at it. But when you're looking for uninspired friendly fighters, you want this in round 1, ideally maybe round 2, round 3. You don't want to see this card because if you go first, you don't even get a power step to be able to play this. So yeah, like there's going to be some push and pull when you're building and when you're playing on these uninspired and inspired windows, and I don't think that's inherently a bad thing. I think that's a fun thing for them to explore, and then you're just going to have to decide which of those cards really works for you.
Yeah. Definitely agree. If you're in Rivals, especially, you will be super happy to have this. If you're in Nemesis, you probably still want it because, like you said, it's extra damage. Like, you just might need more. And damage is definitely not very available in the universal Rivals decks that you can pair with. So, totally agree. I'm not taking this in Champ, almost guaranteed, but
Yeah, me either.
yeah, you're looking at it definitely very hard in Nemesis, and in Rivals, of course, you'll just be glad to have it. I think that's all of the like synergistic cards for the base strategy. I'm pretty darn happy with most of their gambits. I don't think we need to go into the remainders just because like at that point we're starting to turn this into a let's talk about every card they have. But
sure.
But yeah, I encourage folks go check out all their cards, since unfortunately it does sound like it's going to be a little while till we can have these in hand, and see if there's other synergies that you think maybe we missed. But I think that the power cards we highlighted, they highlight the objectives well, and then when you start to see those things work in tandem, it's like, yes, I'm on the right track. This is going to work.
Agree. And as we dive into upgrades here, you're going to see a lot of ways to increase your survivability. So on our way out of gambits, there's one last one I want to highlight because it does speak to survivability, and we're going to be diving heavily into that.
Sure.
And that's Creeping Mist. And this is an echo to Soul Raid.
Yeah.
Soul Raid has a card called Cloud of Midnight that is, essentially allows you to not be chosen by gambits, dealt damage, or pushed. If I'm recollecting correctly, that's the full of it for an activation. And Creeping Mist here, reaction. Play this after a friendly fighter's attack action that takes an enemy fighter out of action. That friendly fighter cannot be the target of attack actions or chosen as the target for a gambit until the start of your next activation step. So if you can get a kill under your belt and you're in a risky position and you have Creeping Mist in hand, you can guarantee no counter attack against you for a full activation and 2 power steps.
Yeah, which is certainly good. I worry about this sitting in hand, especially against like elite warbands, or if your dice are just cold and you're just like, man, I wish I had something that was doing something. Like really powerful effect when you get to use it, but maybe you don't even really care to protect the fighter that you sent in. Maybe they're not the highest priority target. And so I like the card, but after seeing the warband played more and after thinking about their strategies some more, I'm actually lower on the card than I initially was when we first read the cards.
You know what? I am too. It has sat in my hand across rounds in too many games already. Yeah. And I keep wondering, I'm like, do I like this card in theory or in application?
Yeah.
And more testing on my side for
sure. And it's one of those things where it's like, well, maybe if these guys were more aggressive, this would come up more frequently. But if they're more aggressive, you'll have fewer, like in theory, you'll have fewer opportunities to use it too, because unless you started with it in your opening hand or something, you're probably going to end up in a situation where your fighters are either already so wounded or even just dead that you now don't have good application for this. So it's a weird card, just like Cloud of Midnight's a weird card, but Cloud of Midnight is... I understand why they scaled it back. Cloud of Midnight is really annoying and really strong, and trying to make sure that they didn't just immediately reprint that for these guys, I think was a good choice, but I do wonder if it'll still make the cut.
I agree. Yeah. And Cloud at Midnight really synergizes with an invading aggro game plan, right? So to see even, a rendition of it here, that could lead you to think closer to like, oh, I'm going to be, more aggro, more invading. And yes, this is going to be a tool for when you go down that route, but I think they're going to excel when they're not exploring that route.
Yeah. All right. On to the upgrades. We've got, as you mentioned, there's a number of these that are already leaning into survivability, but I think we just see a number of generally good things. Where would you like to start?
Yeah, so on the topic of survivability, I'll dive in. We have a staple, a +1 wounds in the form of Soul Siphon Mantle. This can only be given to thralls. So you can't take a 4 wound Cyreni or Sephenir up to 5, but you can bring the thralls up to 4. And I think in Nemesis particularly, that is extremely meaningful because that gets you outside of that one-shot range where either, a fighter with 2 damage profile and a little boost, is coming at you, or one of the, key 3 damage dealers, is coming at you to take you down. Soul Siphon will keep you in the game much longer.
Yeah, absolutely. I think even potentially in champs, you like this. Survivability, I think, is going to be a sore spot for this warband in champs because of all the different sources of damage that exist. And so having an extra infection, even if it's restricted, great toughness is
Agreed.
just like, yep, let's get it in there.
Sometimes in champs, I tend to lean more into my strengths than shoring up my weaknesses. And sometimes I need to find the balancing act there. So sometimes I'll be mad enough to leave this at home to really just go glass cannon.
Yeah.
But I think this is a good pick in general.
Yeah. One that I think sort of synergizes well again from what we're trying to accomplish in our strategy is this card called Channeled Torment. So it's a little bit weird, but I do think that you can make it work. It is restricted to Ideneth. It says you get 2 separate reactions. One is after this fighter's activation, stagger an adjacent enemy fighter. And the other is after this fighter is dealt damage, stagger an adjacent enemy fighter. So we know we already care about stagger. If you absolutely have to have it, you can just charge a fighter out there and put stagger down. Key to note, it is after the activation, so you won't be able to get this as like part of your charge. It'll be after the attack is resolved that you would be able to put it down. So something to keep in mind. But if you're like, I just really want to score mind erosion, and it's like, I have a 50-50 attack that won't kill the fighter, meaning it won't award any glory, or I could just move and get stagger and then score a glory. Sometimes that's the more efficient play. And then probably where it's going to come up more is the second reaction where somebody else comes to you. They are not using ranged fighters. They don't kill you in one hit, and you then get to put the stagger out. And this one is especially useful because it is after this fighter is dealt damage, not after an activation or after an attack. So it could be off of a ping, it could be off of an attack during the middle of the attack. And so it's much harder to deny that additional stagger token. So when we care about having stagger, you like seeing that kind of window where it's going to be hard to stop.
So, although I agree that this is a stagger tool that synergizes with, your stagger goals, I actually don't like this card.
Yeah, you don't like it?
No, I don't. So I actually have the deck sprawled out in front of me. I was like, what card is that? Because it was the first card I removed and moved off to the side. And the reason this card is like immediately in my do not include pile is because if you're not using it specifically to like set yourself up going into end phase, then that means if you're taking mode 1, where you're after your activation staggering an adjacent enemy fighter, majority of that time you are offering your opponent a supported position against your fighter in future activations. And I don't want to give them that help. I want to lean into my range 2 and, push away. So I don't want to offer them that support. I don't want to offer them maybe an attack into me. I don't think anybody, hopefully, is using this to plant themselves right next to somebody that's going to be able to attack them back for free. But then after this fighter is dealt damage is a great window. I like that window because it's before the out of action check. And I remember thinking, like, that's the secret sauce in this card. However, you're staggering an adjacent enemy fighter. So if they have any range 2 or range 3, they can push you or, like, you know, keep you at arm's length and keep this from going off. So, you know, in the first mode, it's in your control, but you're putting yourself in a risky spot. And then in the second mode, it's completely up to your opponent. It's in their control if they want to give it to you. So it's not for me.
Okay,
I suppose.
Yeah, well, I think that's fair. Obviously, there's going to be differences in opinion on how warbands work. I personally, when I see that I have objectives that I'm chasing that have conditions that are not things that just generically happen in the course of a game, I like to have at least 3 sources of that thing in my power deck or as some other action that I can take with a fighter that will guarantee that it can happen. So when I'm looking at this for like Nemesis and I'm thinking, how am I getting 3 stagger tokens out? It's not like super powerful, but it allows me to guarantee that I have stagger token access. And that's the reasoning for why I like it. Maybe, I mean, I definitely don't take this in champs. I think you can do better than that. And I think in champs and potentially even in Nemesis, and this is something of a, like, it's I don't think it's a bad thing about the game. And I don't really want to get into a philosophical discussion, but I'll just say quickly that, like, there is a world in which all your upgrades are just stat modifiers. That's it. I take less damage, I increase health, I am more accurate. And that's what you do in all your upgrades, and it's boring, but it's efficient. And maybe that's just the best way for the game to be, but I do kind of like having upgrades that do strange or different things.
Oh, absolutely. I agree with you there. It adds more interest, but it also opens, like, if all of my upgrades are just stat blocks, right? Yeah. Then I'm not injecting, like, any form of, like, skill expression into what I can then do with those. Right. I'm living and dying by my stats. But if I'm adding abilities, reactions, opening up what this fighter has to offer, then not only am I increasing my options, but I'm increasing how much my opponent has to think about what my options can do for me.
Absolutely. And I suppose it's worth just quickly mentioning, if you're looking just to be like, okay, which of the remainder of these synergize well with the objective strategy, I'd say almost none of them do. Most of them are there to sort of shore up some of the weaknesses of the warband, I feel like. To your point, there's a lot of survivability things, which is a problem that this warband has. Like, they are fairly squishy. So it's like, hey, take extra wounds, take defensive rerolls, take damage reduction, because it's going to help with just making it harder for the warband to fall down.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah, so to that point, we've got Gifts of the Depths, which is that defensive reroll he spoke to. You can reroll 1 dice in this fighter's defense rolls, restricted to Ideneth. You like this. I think you take this in almost every one of their builds, because at only 1 dice, if you're very often going to need that crit to save you, because if 2 dice are coming in that contain successes, yeah, you know, out of how many were thrown, you know, a crit's the only thing that's going to get you there. So having a reroll is what you need.
Yeah.
You know, extra chances at that crit roll there in Gifts of the Depths.
Yeah, I like thinking about a defensive reroll with a single dice fighter as though you have like a half of an extra defense dice.
Yeah, I think that's a fair way to think of it. And then Void Chill kind of rounds out what they have for defensive upgrades here, with -1 dice to a minimum of 1 from adjacent enemy fighters' attack actions that targets this fighter. Which I like this. I struggle with this. So Soul Raid actually has, this is another Soul Raid Echo here. They have this same card, and it is called, I think there's actually a slight difference, but the Armor of We'll say synthai, but I think I'm a little bit upset.
Yeah,
Anyways,
one of those elvish words. Don't worry about it.
yeah. So what's interesting about this is this promotes being hugged. You know, whether that's you've decided I'm going to put myself against them so that when they attack me, I'm creating that -1 dice, or they have a range 1 attacker that's bringing it to you. So overall, I really like this card. I think that there are a lot of fighters in the meta right now that are excelling at that range 2 and further.
Yeah.
But as we step into the Deathgorge and we're putting up ice columns everywhere, we're changing the math there for those fighters. Like they're sometimes going to be blocked out of that range 2, range 3 position, and they might have to get adjacent to you. So I think the value of something like Void Chill goes up in Deathgorge, and I think overall that if they're throwing less dice at you and you can make that happen, you're happy. And to point back to Channeled Torment for a second, if you can combo these together, it's like, not only am I getting it close to you right now to make your attack worse, then after my activation, I'm going to stagger you. So there you go.
I mean, yeah, when we're living in magical Christmas land, it's like, ooh, perfect. Probably won't really come up, but certainly fun to think about. I do think that it's important to always be thinking about blocked hexes when you're evaluating cards now. We say they'll be more prevalent. How much is really hard to say. On paper, they'll be around. But I'll say in our games, we completely forgot about being able to place them. So I think there'll be like
our initial games there.
There'll be like an on-ramp to remembering to plunder and use some of this effect. And then I think once it clicks and people are like, this is part of my game plan, I'm planning to do this, people will be using it frequently enough that it will matter. How much, who knows? But I think it'll be something to always be thinking about.
Agree. One upgrade that speaks to me regarding like just positional shenanigans, and this can actually help lean into the hold. I think it's their only upgrade that really can do this for you, and it's not there on first blush. I guess so. They have one that offers you a guard token after a fighter's activation. That one's called Incredible Dexterity, and that's done in a reaction.
It's fine.
So that can help. If you're bringing that, you probably really want that on Sephenir, because after he activates, you want to make him so hard to hit, so that anytime somebody does, you're just blinking around and staggering. But the card I was actually going to reference is Great Wake, which is reaction. After this fighter's move action, push a friendly fighter within 3 hexes, 1 hex towards this fighter. I like this one quite a bit. I have always been a fan of the upgrades that allow me to push 1 after my activation. And although this is a unique take here, you're not moving the fighter that just took the activation. You're moving another fighter, pushing them 1 closer to you after you've done a move action. And where that helps, I think, the most is in that hold game plan.
Yep.
So you can hit somebody off an objective, and then if you don't have a push available to you in your gambits, you can then use Great Wake on another fighter to dash forward and pull that previous fighter that did the work to get that person off that objective, onto the objective for you. There's a ton of application anytime you're able to push fighters around, and here it's within 3 hexes. So the bubble of influence here is quite grand.
Yeah. The directional limitation, the range limitation does mean that this is not just like free repositioning, but it's about as close as you can expect to have. So if you are a player who can plan ahead, I think Great Wake is going to do a lot of work for you. There's lots of applications for this. Like, yes, getting onto objectives certainly I think is the first thing that came to my mind, but there should be lots of ways to have this set up future activations and power cards. So I definitely like this one. I think it synergizes really well. I think for me, the last one that I like is like a synergy piece, and it's sort of a synergy adjacent, I guess, piece, is the Soul Scry Lantern. And I don't know that you always take this. It's an Ideneth restricted upgrade, and it says if this fighter is on an objective token at the end of the third action phase, gain 1 glory point. So this is a key, effectively. We've seen all the key upgrades for a number of different printings throughout the history of this game. They're better than they read on paper, and this one in particular has fairly limited restriction. So you can be on any objective, and the fighter technically doesn't even have to be holding the objective. So if for some reason your opponent has a way to say this fighter can't hold objectives, you can still score this. And I say score this because these kinds of upgrades are kind of like having an additional hold single objective in the third end phase for 1 glory. It's like having an extra objective in your deck without taking up an objective slot. So where I see this, and I think we can from here probably transition into like some more general strategy talk and like pairings. Is there any other upgrades that you wanted to hit before we do that?
I can't not talk about Cyreni upgrades without mentioning Savage Ferocity.
Okay, fine.
Because
they have a +1 dice upgrade. It's good. Take it.
It's so good. Yeah, you always bring this. The reason it's so good is simply because it's not limited against scything actions. So you can actually bring this into a scything action with Alethyr or any other sources of scything you're bringing in, you scoundrel.
Yeah. I mean, this could have had any number of restrictions on it and still have been taken almost automatically. I've just been like, yep, +1 dice. It's good. It's really good. An almost unrestricted +1 dice is like asking for this card to be restricted almost. We'll see how strong the warband ends up being. They might need this to like be relevant, but I think on paper and from what we've seen playing them, they feel like they'll be good to me. I think it'll take a while for people to get their legs under them, but I think once they do, it's going to feel rough that they get like, once this comes out, all of a sudden one of their fighters is just a monster. So yeah, definitely take that one. It's good. There's not a lot else to say. We've, +1 dice upgrades throughout the history of this game have been good to the point of problematic. They work well in every strategy because you're always going to be making at least some attacks. So, the generic stuff you always take, right? If there was a generic +1 strength, or +1 damage, you would take that in this deck too. But so the idea I was going to get to.
Yeah.
So the Soul Scry Lantern.
Excellent.
In the way that it is sort of strategy adjacent is that I imagine a lot of what I'm doing is, you've got the squid and your 2 boys up front, or I guess they're not boys. They're not both male, but whatever. They're soulless guys hanging out up front. I think you don't necessarily deploy them super aggressively, but my imagining is that most often you'll sort of have one line with them, kind of midline, and then you'll keep Cyreni herself back so that she's safer. And so you should, unless things go really wrong, have Cyreni alive towards the end of the game. And if your final activation with Cyreni has to just be, I move on to an objective and I have Soul Scry Lantern, that doesn't feel like a bad thing to me.
Yeah, I agree. I think the place that this ends up being awkward is just when you draw it early, right?
Of course,
because then you have to dedicate it in round 1, round 2, and you might not have that fighter in round 3. But overall, I really like this space, a key being found here, because I agree with you. I think it speaks to their game plan. If I'm spending a lot of energy staying back, I'm not necessarily going to have a need for as many upgrades. I don't think. Like, I almost feel I feel weird saying that because like upgrades are always good, right?
Yeah.
But upgrades are often good when you're interacting. So if you're taking a lot of time trying to stay back and get ready, then I think you might actually have room for this in your upgrade deck, because you might really only need those 9 upgrades and this can be your 10th. And offer you a way to flex into a little more glory.
Yeah. And I think this is definitely something you are probably reaching for more in Nemesis than you are in Championship. But I think you at least consider it in both. And being fully available to all Ideneth fighters, I think is really good, not having it restricted to just the thralls or just your leader. But that is sort of a rundown of all of our like key cards. Sort of what are all the cards you're looking to build your strategy around, support your strategy. I think it would be remiss to not mention that, like, despite that this is the way that we are sort of seeing that we think they will flow the easiest, there are potentially other ways you could play these warbands. One that sort of comes to my mind and feels very weird and probably hard to play, but potentially could work, is like a very controlling magic build. Instead of leaning into all the fighters, you like double down on Cyreni.
Yeah, I was thinking about this too.
And so I think we can use this sort of as a jumping off point into pairings, but it is something to keep in mind that I think this warband could flex into another sort of control-y or magic heavy build. But personally, despite what GW said, I see, if I look at any of the stuff where it's like, man, I'm going to do invading aggro, I just see that plan just falling on its face. Like, what am I going to do if I'm invading aggro into Gore Chosen? Like, it feels awful, right?
Yeah. No, I mean, I just think the answer is you're not invading.
Yeah, you just don't.
At least as your main strat.
No.
Right? Like there are going to be times where you realize there's a passive horde warband across the table from you, and your game plan's going to shift instantly. You know, to invade. But
what? Who said that?
But it's not going to be where you start as a strategy, and I don't think it should be with this warband. That's adapting to the moment and the matchup, not what you're kind of carving out as your baseline.
Yeah, agreed. So all of that in mind, saying that we think there's sort of this flex hold, but probably on the more patient, passive, potentially controlling side of flex, where do we see their pairings and why?
Yeah, I'll kick off here. So I teased earlier that Fearsome Fortress stands out as extremely synergistic to me. And there are a few key reasons for that. One, when somebody tells me that they're playing Fearsome Fortress across the table from me, immediately I consider longboarding that opponent to reduce how many hexes occupy within one of no man's land, right?
Yep.
So if your opponent seeks to disrupt you by longboarding you to counter Fearsome Fortress, then they've also created that tighter span of lanes that I was talking about more. Your lanes are more dense, and it's easier to reach each and every one and just laser down a long stretch instead of trying to find these angles. So Fearsome Fortress is interesting there alone, but the synergies keep coming with your Sephenir being able to teleport to that area and help you score things like Conquered Domain.
Yeah.
And Stockpile could offer you the chance to hold one back in your territory, so you can spend like an early activation, especially in your earlier rounds where you're trying to hold back. If you're lucky on numbering, you can have some investment in the tokens in the back. And then a later activation can be sending Sephenir with his flying 5 movement, down to the other objective that you need. But 2 cards that kind of stand out for me as further synergizing with them is Opportunistic Reprisal. I think they are the number 1 warband in the game that likes this card. I think most of the time this card is a trap. Here, in this pairing, you take it. This is reaction. Play this after an enemy fighter's attack action if that fighter is staggered. Choose one friendly fighter. So any friendly fighter. The chosen fighter makes one attack action that must target that enemy fighter. So obviously, whichever fighter you're picking has to be within range. But very often, If you're leaning into hammertide and using Sephiroth to help be an attractive target that's dealing out stagger through phasing, you're creating staggered fighters. It's part of what you want to do. So there's a strong chance that you're going to be able to capitalize off of opportunistic reprisal. And then additionally, they have makeshift bombardment. So choose one friendly fighter on a feature token and choose one enemy fighter visible to that friendly fighter and within 3 hexes of that friendly fighter. Pick one, stagger the chosen enemy fighter. So there's some stagger support. Or push the chosen enemy fighter 1 hex away from the chosen friendly fighter. So this is going to help with your stagger game plan. And when it's not helping you with your stagger game plan, it has the flexibility to help you push fighters away.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think the synergies here, don't stop there, but those are definitely the ones that I kind of wanted to highlight.
Absolutely. I certainly think it has the most synergies, and as you said, like, it keeps going. There's more things that work well together. In terms of objectives, I do think that you are liking a lot of what you see. It does force you a little more into the center hold stuff, but I think there's room to be able to say, I'm not going to try and get onto those right away. If my opponent wants to come onto those tokens and try and deny me being on them, it gives me opportunities to hit them first. Which I think it sort of gives a nice push-pull there, where like it's okay, and that's almost a trap for my opponent to end up sitting where I can then counterpunch them instead of me moving up and then getting counterpunched. So I like that. And then you have 2 different weapon options. And as you mentioned, Sephiroth can have weapons. So giving Sephiroth either Mason's Great Hammer or the Star Maw, which the mental image of Sephiroth holding a gun is pretty great. But having both options, I think, is helpful for Sephiroth to have those extra avenues for some damage. And
agree. There's one more end phase actually that I'll highlight here that I think is a really interesting synergy, and it's one I normally stay away from in Fearsome Fortress offerings. It's Siege Breakers. So this is score this in an end phase if there are no enemy fighters in your territory to glory. And I think that this is inviting them into your territory. This gives them reason to come into your territory, right?
Oh,
where
sure.
You're going to be able to play reactionary. Yeah. So like if they don't know this is in your deck and they're scared to kind of enter your web, if you will, then this could score for you in like that first game of a best of 3, surprisingly, and that's 2 glory. But then in the rest of that best of 3, they're thinking, I gotta get over there. I gotta get somebody over there to prevent Siege Breakers. And you're like, yes, please do. Bring somebody over.
Yeah. Come stand near my range 2 fighters so they don't have to charge into enemy territory, please. Let's do it. Yeah, definitely agree. Not one I had thought about. I certainly like it. So we're high on Fearsome Fortress. Skylar's on the episode, so who would have thunk? But in all seriousness, it does seem like a good choice. I think, I haven't thought through a lot of like how would I score with this pairing. I think the extra movement from Void Curse Thralls feels really good.
I think so too. I've been building a deck for this.
And your fighters, most of them are on 1 defense dice anyway. And so you don't really mind being on 1 block, because either you're already 1 block or like the whole almost of the first round, Sephiroth's 1 dodge. So Sephiroth on 1 block feels even better. So there's not a lot of downside. Obviously, you don't want to Void Curse your wizard. That would be bad. That Hammertide going away is going to be really rough. Oh, and I guess something that we probably should mention in thinking about Nemesis pairings, also think about your opponents. Cyreni in a matchup against Void Curse Thralls just cannot stand on an objective. Just don't do it. Because if they turn off, because there's the snare, the reshaping snare card, if they just turn her into a Void Curse like turn 1, oof.
Yeah.
Real bad.
Mind your footing.
Yep. Keep that in mind. But I do think there's a lot of flexibility in the power cards for things you can do with Void Curse Thralls, and I'm sure you could find ways to work around The objectives, honestly, I don't love the objective deck that much for Void Curse Thralls, but I think the rest of the deck is so strong that it almost doesn't matter. So I think I would at least look at it, and like you said, you've been building a deck for it just to see. So I think that's a good one. Any others that you're thinking about?
Yeah, so I actually want to, I know you just brought up Void Curse Thralls, but I want to pass the mic back to you and ask you about Force of Frost.
Oh, okay.
Is there anything that you think is particularly good there? I think you were talking to, this doubling down on your leader and her being a wizard and working off of that.
Yes.
I think that really exists here and has potential. So tell me a little bit more about that on your side.
Yeah, so it's definitely a more risky play because you do only have the one wizard and only, not a huge amount of like natural inclination into magic, but there are plenty of spells that put out blocked hexes and other things that can disrupt your opponents. So if your plan is to like hang back and make it harder for them to get to you, you can definitely use all your spells to like just be disruptive. Try and play control. Be like, I'm going to put down this blocked hex. I'm going to make it harder for you to get to me. I'm going to like use things like Frozen to the Spot to give a move token, or make it so that if your fighter moves, they'll take damage. And you just kind of can set things up that way. And I think you sort of end up leaning even more control than you normally would if you go with Force of Frost. And you're really building around this idea that like, I'm going to use the rest of the warband to protect Cyreni. And most of what I'm doing really is just sitting back with Cyreni and like hammertiding and setting up to try and do things like cast extra spells, set up blocked hexes, be in the way, just trying to do that kind of positional scoring. I don't have like a really strong sense of exactly what you would do. I do like the idea of being able to make another one of your fighters a wizard using the Everwinter staff, because it doesn't hurt to have that extra wizard. And I think that between the spells for being disruptive in Force of Frost and having your center of attention clone and your extra move action spell, you could have a pretty nice package of like utility spells, and having that extra caster could be really important.
Agree. And this is the only pairing where the squid can be a wizard.
It's true. Squid Wizard is something that would be a personal goal, I think.
In fact, that gives you that range 2 weapon too.
It does. And I guess it's worth calling out. The Frostworm Cloak is kind of broken, and being able to put Frostworm Cloak on Sephenir seems really nuts. -1 damage on the squid. Probably just leave him alone. Like, you're probably not taking him out of action, which means he's gonna get to do the squid thing, which means he's gonna stagger and teleport. And oh boy, I think there's a lot of interesting, weird things that you could do with this pairing. The objectives are kind of all over the place, and like the ones I would normally look to in the deck are Bitter Storm, Winter's Hunger, and Cold of the Void. And I don't... Winter's Hunger feels fine. I think you can make that work in like a passive control build. I don't know if I want to lean super heavily into casting 4 spells with this warband, so I would be a little hesitant for Bitter Storm. And then Cold of the Void I think is just always good, but you've got to be able to catch people out with it, at least at first. But you do have a lot of like shenanigans with movement, so maybe you can just make it happen.
Yeah, I actually really like Cold of the Void here because you have that range 2, you have great movement stats, and then Sephenir, you're only range 1.
Yeah, teleport.
Yep, exactly. So he can just teleport away. So I think Cold of the Void's a really solid pick here. Void Curse Thralls is a matchup that you're not looking forward to when you're running this card, because they're refashioned reactions, which is the one that allows them to move adjacent to a fighter.
Yep.
Can put this out right away.
Absolutely.
So I've been toying around with Force of Frost, actually all three of these that we've discussed, and I haven't ventured too far outside of it. You kind of do experiments in your mind where you're like, let me think about what I know about that deck. Will that pair here? And these are really the three that stood out to me. I'm sure there are synergies elsewhere that I'm not thinking through. But as I've been toying around with Force of Frost, Stranglehold is a surge for 2 glory. Score this immediately after an opponent's power step if your warband holds each objective within 2 hexes of no one's territory. And what I've been finding with this card, paired with the Razors here, is that Sephir can do a lot of work towards this card. So with it in hand, what I found myself doing is like I ran into enemy territory onto an objective, flipped it, right? It's just like, and delve this. And then I got attacked. And then I had a defensive upgrade on him. Actually, I think it was Frostworm Cloak. So I didn't take much damage for this. And I teleported away to another hex that, that was a feature token within this requirement. But now the only feature token that is an objective within this requirement. Yeah. So, You have some shenanigans to help you score Stranglehold here that I think are totally worth exploring.
Yeah, it's some fun stuff. I totally agree. I think it is one that is worth exploring, and important to note as we transition to talking about Championship, Force of Frost does not have a plot card.
Does not. No, I think it would be very worthwhile dipping into this. When you're playing Cyreni's Razors and you're playing Championship and you're not limited to this pairing, I think you're dipping into it. Yeah, for sure. So one gambit from here that I want to highlight because I think it's particularly interesting. It's interesting on its own. It's Time Freeze, but there's some extra interest when it's played with Cyreni's Razors. So I'm gonna run down Time Freeze real quick. This is play this only in your power step. Choose 2 friendly fighters. Give each chosen fighter 1 ice counter and 1 guard token. In your next activation step, you must take the pass action. In your following activation step, in the same phase, you can take 2 activations. In each of those activations, you must activate a different chosen fighter or pass. And I like this for 2 reasons here. First off, I have not cracked the code on this card. There's a big cost here. The implicit cost here is you're allowing your opponent to have 2 activations before you then take 2 activations. So they're going to get first crack at two activations, and they're not limited on which fighters they activate. They can activate the same fighter if they so choose and have the ability to do so. But we were talking about holding back, right? So this allows you to say, hey, I want to hang back a bit. Why don't you take 2 activations before I start, right? So this kind of leans and synergizes into your hold back and react play. But what this also does is this could allow you to take an additional inspired activation that you would not normally have access to. And that is a uniquely Cyreni Razor thing.
Oh, that's a good point.
And I haven't done that yet, but I'm excited to pull it off.
Yeah, I mean, that is going from what would normally be 6 activations inspired to 7 is not insignificant. Yeah, it's something to think about. I hadn't considered that. I like it though. Cool. So we've definitely dove deep, both into the warband and into Nemesis. I think we don't really have a lot of play experience with Championship yet. I think that's worth mentioning, but I do want to just talk briefly about what we think we would be doing differently in Championship before we close this episode out. So any final thoughts on Nemesis before we transition?
Nemesis, no. I think we are covered there with what we set out to cover.
Yeah, I would agree. And so with Championship, as we mentioned, Force of Frost doesn't have a plot card, so I think you're cherry picking out of this deck for sure. How much, that will probably depend on what kind of strategy you landed on. I do think that the passive hold control stuff becomes easier in Championship because you also get access to Seismic Shock, which gives you access to Claim the Prize, which anybody who hasn't run into that card yet, good on you for not having to deal with that. But that one's really good and is usually a hold 2. And for a warband that's pretty happy to just sit back in their own territory and try to deny their opponent, I really like the idea of just hold 2 in your territory for 3 glory.
I do as well.
So, you know, there's other utility things that you can pick up there in Seismic Shock as well. I think the big question then becomes in Championship, which plot card deck do you want, and which thing is giving you the most value in Championship, and sort of like what is it that you're still needing in terms of strategy? Do you need more power cards? Because I think in that case I'm probably leaning more towards Void Curse Thralls. Do I need better objectives? In that case I think I'm probably leaning towards Fearsome Fortress. It's an interesting division point, at least in my mind, because like I think you could realistically build a Championship deck with either one, and then you'd use a lot of the same pieces for both, but the ultimate like play style from where that split is, I think makes them play very differently. And I don't know what the right answer is.
Yeah. I think there are a few right answers in the ideas of like what you don't take. So like you're probably not taking Tooth and Claw as your plot card here, because a lot of what that has to offer looks for range 1 and your range 2. So you're likely not grabbing Tooth and Claw. You're likely not grabbing Breakneck Slaughter. And the reason for that is if you ever have momentum that you need to manage with Impetus, then if I was playing against a Cyrenized Razor player who brought Breakneck Slaughter and I was handling this reaction, I would simply push that fighter into my fighter. So what is accomplished there is then they are staggered.
Yeah.
And like I'm on 1 defense dice. I do not want to give my opponent even better odds at taking me down. So Breakneck Slaughter on its own is like has amazing aggro objectives, but I don't think you're playing them aggro. And then again in power, you kind of want to stay away from momentum with this warband. So those are like some plot cards I know I'm not taking.
Yep.
But I think you did a really good breakdown on why you'd be reaching for Void Curse or Fearsome Fortress, and you did so succinctly in a few words.
Sure. I guess anything else that you can think of for Championship that might be different from what we've discussed in Nemesis already, that it would be like, hey, this is going to be a cool thing that you get to add in Championship that you wouldn't see otherwise, or maybe even like a change up in strategy that you otherwise wouldn't see?
I think Championship is ultimately going to allow them to focus up into a single game plan and weed out the cards that are going to pull you out of safety or not sync as well with that game plan. So where that puts you, I think, as a Cyreni Razors player, is you're either doubling down super hard on Cyreni as your wizard and potentially bringing in a backup wizard, and then focusing on that and focusing on staying back and doing as much as you can between hammertide and spells. That's going to be one play style. I think another play style is going to be pushing them further back into their territory on those 2 objectives, and path to victory, offering them they only need to get 1. They need to take 1 fighter out of action, and they could accomplish that just with hammertide. And then making sure that they can position onto those objectives. So that's where I would live. That's what I want to explore in Championship, is a really passive hold back, hold 2, and counterpunch. Play really cagey like. Which these are things that we were exploring as part of their game plan identity and as what you can do with them in Nemesis, but you can really just focus it up in Championship.
Yeah, I agree. I think that makes a lot of sense.
And there's a mad scientist out there that is going to build a deck that just focuses on using hammertide 12 times.
Probably.
With like 10 pushes and movement tricks.
It's not even an inefficient strategy, right? Like if you can make it happen where you get to use hammertide 12 times, that's 12 damage. Like, that's a lot of fighters dead without having to roll a single die. So add some ping cards in there, and all of a sudden it's like, wow, how much damage access do you have without rolling dice? And I do like that. I do think there's at least the potential, maybe not right now with the universal pool, but I do think that if there were to ever be a warband to do like a pure, I'm going to score mainly off of stagger tokens, like this kind of feels like a warband that could do it as long as we got the objective support for it.
Agree.
So I would definitely at least look at the options for doing something like that before I decided it's impossible. My guess is it's impossible, but I certainly like it as an idea. So it's also something I'll be, well, I probably won't play these guys right away, if at all, but I will be thinking about it in the event that somebody else chooses to play it.
I'll make sure they stay front of mind for you.
All right. Sounds good. I imagined you would. Any final thoughts? I think we've done a good job of covering the set out goals of explaining what the warband is, what they do well, and what cards support that strategy, and then what we would pair with them. So unless there's anything else that you think needs mentioning, I think we can close it out here.
I think in closing, one thing I'll say is if you find yourself across the table from Cyreni's Razors and you're looking to make an attack against Sephenir, I would just think twice about that attack and what it can do for your opponent. Keep that phasing in mind.
Yeah. I mean, man, you can't underestimate how many opportunities and how many options there are when you're going to have a teleporting squid after you attack him.
Yeah. I think there's going to be a lot of time where the Razors player is happy that Sephenir was the target chosen.
Yeah, I agree. Which also makes me think they'll probably position Sephenir forward quite a bit. So unless you have a good way to take him down quickly, maybe don't fall into the trap of making small attacks against him.
Agree. All right. Well, I've had a blast covering Cyreni's Razor with you, Phil. Any final thoughts on your side?
No, I think we can close it out here.
All right, let's do it.
All right. As always, we've espoused our thoughts now for a couple hours. But if you have any thoughts about the warband, if there's any takes that you think are egregious, or if there's things you think we missed, let us know about them. The easiest way to get a hold of us is in our Discord, and we'd love to have you there. There's people chatting about all things Underworlds kind of all the time. If you're not a Discord person, you can also reach us at What the Hexcast on the platform formerly known as Twitter, and whatthehexcast@gmail.com. If you'd like to check out any of our previous episodes or any of the other content from the Mortal Realms podcast group, you can head on over to themortalrealms.com. We have all the shows up there and all of our links to our shows and the blog posts that we have. Coming up next, this is pretty much wrapping up the end of our new release content. We haven't quite done anything for specifically Force of Frost or specifically Breakneck Slaughter yet. TBD on what exactly we're going to do for those, but we are likely going to have something involving those. Maybe we'll have a bat rep with some of these new warbands, but stay tuned. There will be something, not entirely sure what yet. And as we come closer to this new release, we know there's going to be a rotation happening. Some old Universal cards will be leaving us. At the very least, we expect Harrow Deep to be going. So if you have any cards from Harrow Deep that you are going to be particularly glad to have gone, or if you are going to really miss, let us know. We are likely going to have some sort of discussion at some point once we get whatever docs they decide to publish to show us what the rotation actually is going to look like. Sort of a discussion of what does that mean? What does the landscape look like now that that rotation has happened? All right. That brings us to the infamous Flavitex quiz. Skyler, are you ready for a flavor-text quiz?
Absolutely.
All right. I have a card here, and this is one you really like, so hopefully you can get it. That's your clue. If it catches you, it's over.
It's momentary vortex.
It sure is. It's momentary vortex. He got it first try. Didn't even have to hesitate. Just knew it.
Ding, ding, ding.
Right off the top. I figured you might get it, but it's a good one, and I know it's one you liked. All right, and then your recommended listening for this episode, a much less heady choice than probably what Davey would pick for you, but I figured, we're mermaid adjacent. Let's go for some Death Clock, some mermaider. Some mermaid murder. That'll do it for us. For What the Hex, I've been Phil.
And I've been Skyler.
There are some spells. I'm just double checking.